Hey everyone, welcome back. For this presentation, I'm going to talk about Chapter 6. Chapter 6 really looks at cultural competence through the research lens. What does it actually look like in all of the steps of the research process? Rubin and Babbie talk about cultural competence in relationship to the research process in this chapter. They have a great definition on page 113, and it says that cultural competence is being aware of and appropriately responding to the ways in which cultural factors and cultural differences can influence all stages of the research process. And really the emphasis is on the all stages. We can't look at a narrow swath of research articles and formulate our question, create a hypothesis, and pick the standardized tools without having the group of people that we're studying in mind. So if I'm going to hand out a study to individuals living in an urban community versus white undergraduates at a Midwestern university, I need to be really aware of the group of people that I'm studying, and it needs to be influenced at all levels of the process. So this means at the very beginning, when we're starting to formulate our problem, when we're doing our research and our literature reviews, we need to be really sure that we're culturally sensitive even at the very beginning and then as we go through the whole process. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So the book gives you a couple of sections. So one is about research participants. So making sure how we sample is culturally sensitive. So if I want to look at, let's say, community members, and I'm going to define community members as my town, and I want to go sample community members and know more about their perceptions of, let's say, a local council initiative. Well, if I sit and I stand in one specific neighborhood that's not very diverse, maybe it's a upper class neighborhood that's predominantly one race, and I sample those people and then I go to the city council and say, look, everybody is totally into this initiative, it's not really representative of the entire community. So we have to be really careful when we're looking at how we sample and who we sample, that we're aware of the different elements, different groups, different racial differences, gender, all of those things, because we want to make sure that if we're going to say this is a generalizable study, we really have to make sure it's a random sample of people and that we've really got a variety of viewpoints, backgrounds, beliefs, and demographics included in that. So the book talks a little bit about that and some of the laws that were passed to make sure that enough people of different groups are represented to make our studies effective. It also comes through in measurement and data collection. So that means we're going to look at things like tools or measures that are reliable and valid for minority groups. And we'll talk about reliability and validity a little bit later in the book. But basically, when you have a tool of some sort of assessment tool, a lot of times they'll go through testing to make sure that they have high reliability and high validity for minority groups. If it's only been tested on one group of individuals, how do we know it's going to effectively measure the same thing in a minority group of individuals? So we really want to make sure that we're aware and we're picking measures that are reliable and valid for the groups of people we're looking at. We also want to use sensitivity in our wording and our scales, making sure that we are honoring the individuals. And this is a great way to look at the community representative and say, how do you think individuals would best prefer to be referred to in this, especially in the more delicate ones like the LGBTQ community? You might have a leader that says, no, it's important for you to include two-spirit on there. You might be in a community with a high number of individuals who identify as maybe non-binary, and so maybe talking to a leader or representative, or just looking at other literature to say what is a way that will really honor the participants when it comes to wording. Also, we may choose quantitative versus qualitative data. American culture, not always, but as a whole, we tend to be very data-driven, while other cultures may be more interested in the process than the hard outcomes and data. So you may want to look at a specific group and say, wow, they really would much rather go through a qualitative process where I interview them and they talk and they share and it's more of a back and forth than here, fill out this survey, we're going to come up with some research data out of it. So being aware of culture and how they perceive outcomes, data versus not, may also drive the type of study that we do. We also have to look at time and pace of things as well. Some cultures may view time as a slow pace to be enjoyed. So if I'm doing a qualitative research study and I've got interviewers and they're coming in and they're like, no, we need to ask questions. Everyone gets 15 minutes and then they're out of here. Well, you may have a cultural group that views it as like, hey, no, let's talk. It's very dialogue oriented. They want to share things. It's a very slow pace. And so you could see how that could be really insensitive for the interviewer to be like, well, that's enough. Your time is up. So understanding that is important. And finally, another area to be really sensitive when we're looking at measurement, data collection, reporting is the idea that some cultures are more individualistic individualistic and some are more collectivist. And so depending on the type of culture people come from, they may not be comfortable answering certain things. Let's say you come from a culture that's very collectivist and it's all about the good of the larger community. Well, if I'm asking you a bunch of questions about all the things you're unhappy about in your community, you may be reluctant to say anything. You may be reluctant to disclose anything that makes your family look bad, like abuse or a history of substance use issues. So we just have to be really aware of the people that we're studying, the concept we're studying, and make sure that we're sampling and using appropriate sensitive measurement tools in a way that really benefits the participants. Also, when you were looking at analysis and reporting, this is also a big area. Just because you've collected the data doesn't mean that our cultural awareness stops. We also want to make sure that we're looking at individual groups. You don't want to look under like Caucasian and not Caucasian, or you don't want to divide it up into individuals who identify as one gender and those who do everything else, right? That's not sensitive. It's not responsible. We want to make sure ideally that we have people and representatives from different groups and that we're really honoring each group as a whole. We want to look at people who identified as Caucasian, people who identified as Black, people who identified as Alaskan Native, whatever that may be, to honor each group and not just say, well, you're not part of the dominant group, so we're not going to look at research. We're just going to lump you all together. So we really want to make sure that we are sensitive in how we define and disclose the data that we get. We also need to emphasize things like strengths, which is so valuable. We want to make sure that we're looking at the good things the community has. So instead of doing a study that's failed foster care adoptions, maybe we look a little bit deeper in the culture and say, what strengths do they have when it comes to foster care? Maybe they do it more informally than formally. So we really want to make sure that we're emphasizing strengths. We also need to understand the larger cultural context. When we're analyzing and reporting things, you wouldn't want to write a report that's insensitive or doesn't reflect the values of the cultural group that you're studying. And I thought the book was really interesting because it talks a lot about the level of acculturation and the idea that there are levels of acculturation when individuals come to a country and they're learning the language and adapting to the customs. And the idea is that people acculturate at different levels. So a couple considerations to be aware of. One is we really want to avoid ethnocentrism. That is the belief in the superiority of your own culture. So it says, my culture is the best way, it's the only way, everybody else is doing it wrong. And so we really want to make sure that we don't have that perspective of like, oh, I'm the researcher from the dominant culture, so I know what's going on and my participants don't. We really do not want to do that in any way. We come with an open, curious mind, see what we can learn or what strengths that cultural group brings. We don't want to come in with this preconceived notion of we're in a better culture for any reason. We don't want to assume that our participants should change to fit our study. We need to make sure that we accommodate them. If they live an hour and a half away, we don't say, well, you have to meet at my center, so you need to figure out how to get here. We give them a bus pass. Maybe we rent a community center office closer to where they are. We make sure that their forms are in their language, right? You really want to make sure that we are adapting to the participants instead of them having to adapt to us. And I think just being aware of past history and how it affects current groups' distrust of research institutions. The video I'm going to have you watch at the end talks about that. You're going to learn a lot about in the city module. And it's important to understand the historical events that have led to distrust instead of saying, well, I'm doing everything right. I don't know why they don't trust me. What's wrong with that group? Don't they want to know more? Well, there may be a reason for the distrust, and we have to honor that. Maybe work with community leaders, see if there's something that you can address, or maybe that's just not the right study of the right group at that time, and that's okay as well. That also speaks to the value of finding those community leaders to make sure they can give you good advice, support you as you try to recruit and discuss and meet with their participants. And I think it's really important to be aware of nonverbal and verbal cues. Even if it's like your interviewers or if it's you, a lot of cultures have different meanings. So there was a really good framework and they talked about even words like yes have different meanings in different cultures. Some participants will say yes because they don't want to disappoint the interviewer, not because they agree with it. Or maybe in their language, yes is like an affirmation, but it doesn't mean they agree with you. So you really want to make sure that you and your interviewers, or however you're interacting, make sure that you understand some of those nonverbal and verbal things that may vary from culture to culture and could have a significant effect. If you interview 20 people and they all say yes to something, you might say, oh look, 100% of people agree, or 30% agree, but 70% don't want to look bad, or they don't want to disappoint you, or they don't agree, they're just saying, yes, I understood what you asked. So we really want to make sure we're aware of some of those cultural differences. Finally, a few measurement considerations. And again, I'm just highlighting a few. The book has a lot of information, but I think it's really well outlined, so I don't want to bore you because I know you're reading through this. The book also talks about the value in matching interviewers to the group if possible, whether that's through language or race. Let's say a cultural group already has a lot of distrust of an individual. Can you imagine how complicated it would be to then have that individual come in and be so different and feel so much like an outsider or part of the dominant culture that they don't want to say anything, or they may not feel safe to be honest and open about things. So if you can match interviewers, that's great. If not, it's again working with community leaders. It's making sure, is there someone you can partner with? All of those things to make sure that we're being sensitive. We also need to make sure that we're translating consent forms into the individual's language. Informed consent forms can be very long and very wordy. So even if English is your first language and you're reading through it, it is a lot to take in, all the risks, the benefits, all the information about the study. And so if English is not your first language, that would be even harder to understand because there are so many words and so many concepts they may not know. So it's important to make sure that we're translating informed consents into the individual's language. And even you might have the opportunity to make sure that your interviewer also goes over that with the individuals just to make sure, hey, can we review the form? I want to make sure that you feel comfortable when you sign it. It's also important to note that bias and measurement tools goes beyond language. It can be challenging with concepts or phrases. So I think of an example. I worked at a psychiatric hospital and we had a young man whose parents had come here from Mexico pretty recently, probably within a few years. And he sadly was demonstrating the symptoms of schizophrenia already at a young age. It was very heartbreaking. And I remember my psychiatrist that I worked with very closely, he's wonderful. He was from Puerto Rico, and so he was fluent in Spanish. And he said it was really challenging because not only was he having to translate kind of his normal things that he would say into Spanish, but he acknowledged he spoke Puerto Rican Spanish, so there may be a few words that were different. And he said, I'm trying to explain medical terminology, things like delusions and hallucinations and all the words that go around schizophrenia. And I just remember him saying, even as a native Spanish speaker, he said, this is really challenging to make sure that they understood what I was saying. The concepts came across clearly. He said some of them were phrases they'd never heard before. And so he's like, I have to explain the medical terms, simplify it, then translate it. And so we really have to make sure that we understand it's not just language, it's concepts, it's how cultures view things. It may not be as obvious. For example, if you say, well, I'm going to study depression, that might mean something totally different to one group than another. And so just being aware of that it's not as simple as saying, hey, I took this really great measurement tool and I translated it into Vietnamese. They'll be fine. They understand it. No, there may be concepts or phrases that do not translate well or really aren't measuring what you hope to measure in the first place. It also talks in the book about the challenges with defining a group as well. So remember, there's often as many differences between groups as within groups and vice versa. And so what this means is when you are trying to study a group, what does that look like? What characteristics define that group? And that can be sometimes challenging. Maybe you want to study individuals who speak Mandarin. But do you look at individuals who have recently come here from China? Are they visiting here from China? Do they live in another country and maybe grew up speaking Mandarin? Are they American citizens that speak Mandarin because they grew up at home with two parents from China? So many different ways that you can look at it. And so you have to make sure that you don't get too broad and say, well, I'm just going to study everyone in this group. You have to be really careful and really clear about what are the parameters that you're looking at and that openness to say, ooh, maybe that was too broad. Maybe I need to narrow it down a little bit. Finally, we just want to make sure that we are aware of things like cultural issues, taboos, and that some people, even if you translate the measurement tool, even if you translate the interview really well, there just may be topics that people are not comfortable talking about with you. And that's okay too. That's something you chalk up to limitations typically as a researcher and you move on. But it is better to be culturally sensitive than to force something that really disempowers or could potentially harm the individuals that we're studying. So at the end of this module, to tie it all together, you're going to watch a 6.5-minute video from a geneticist who talks about kind of this relationship between research science, indigenous peoples, and ethical research. He is a native Hawaiian and he shares some really interesting statistics and information about how we look at research, how we study cultural groups, and some of the problems and issues we've had. And so as you're watching this video, I'd love for you to think, how do ethics and cultural competence affect each other in research? And this idea of, does culturally competent research allow us to be ethical researchers, which is empowering people, honoring groups, and using those strong social work skills? And do ethics require us to be completing culturally competent research? Do we believe as social workers that part of our values includes cultural competence? And so we need to make sure that ethically, if we're doing research, we're following those. And something that you'll think about for your discussion board is, how might you engage a vulnerable group in research ethically. You'll be given a scenario of a group, and I want you to walk through in your head, how might you engage them ethically? What would you need to do based on the information in this video and from the book and your own thoughts to be able to study them and work with them ethically? Okay, there are my references. Good luck. Thanks.